Welcome back, everyone. We have another interesting show for you. We have with us today the great Dennis Vacco. So you can't, first of all, talk about Dennis without mentioning the late, great Carmen Vacco. Dennis's father died at the age of 94. He served the Erie County Republican Committee for over 40 years as first vice chairman. Carmen was a hardworking owner of Vacco Farms in Brant. He was the head of the South Towns Chairman Committee. There were numerous times I would meet with Carmen over decades and relied on his counsel. Carmen was just a hardworking, really down-to-earth, very involved individual. And, I'm certainly proud and glad that I had the years that I had with him. Now, I met Dennis in 1978, 47 years ago, at the beginning of Dennis's career as an assistant district attorney here in Erie County. He served as the assistant district attorney and did an extremely good job. And then in 1988, he was appointed as the U.S. Attorney for the Western District of New York, appointed by Ronald Reagan. That's an extremely important job, and he was extremely capable. So he served that from 1988 to 1993. And then in 1994, he was elected New York State Attorney General, elected from Western New York, from Erie County. He became New York State's Attorney General in 1994. He served as Attorney General from January of 1995 through December 31st of 1998 under George Pataki. He's now a partner in Lippis Mathias, a law firm that when he joined was one office and now several offices and hundreds of lawyers. He's a senior partner. Again, a close friend of mine since 1978. Dennis, I appreciate you being here.
Ralph, good morning, and it's a real pleasure to join you. And thank you so very much for that, gracious recognition of my father. I can tell you, as I'm sure you know, that the feeling, the respect and admiration was mutual between the two of you. I can remember early on in my career many instances where the advice and counsel was actually going both ways, and in many respects, the two of you were real powerhouses in terms of government and politics in Southern Erie County. And ultimately, as you both, rose up through the ranks and you became the county chairman, the Conservative Party county chairman, and Dad was the vice chair. I mean, it was just a very fruitful personal and professional relationship. So I thank you very much for recognizing that on the front
Well,
end.
give me a little history of your dad. I mean, tell us about how he got involved. I mean, he had a farm. He was a hard worker. How did he get involved in politics? And, I mean, he offered so much, but it was so much about the qualities inside that man. So give me a little bit about it.
Yeah. So, like so many, your mom and dad, your ancestors, and like so many other families across Western New York, I mean, an ethnic family, religious family, immigrants that came to the United States with the intention of integrating, becoming, part of the fabric of society and the fabric of culture here. And so many immigrants who have contributed greatly to this country. I'd like to think that my grandparents and my parents after them were part of strengthening our community and our nation. His father, my grandfather came to the United States as a young man, less than 15 years old, with his family. My dad was born here in the United States along with my mom. He graduated from North Collins Central High School because in 1940, my grandfather, his dad, moved from the west side of Buffalo to Brant, New York.
Wow, that was some move. Then I'm going from the west side where all the Italians were out to Brant. That was a major move.
Well, in those days, So, leading up to that move, the farming community, much like today, still requires, despite advances in mechanization and equipment to harvest crops, you still need a ready supply of manual labor. And in the 20s and 30s, the manual labor was, in many instances, were the ethnic families that would come out from the city in the summertime,
right,
to go and spend the summers working on the farms, or at least some members of the family working on the farms in southern Erie County and in Chautauqua County as well.
My mother was one of those people that she was, had a big family, 5 kids at that point for her, and would go in the summers and pick. That's what they did.
That's what they did. And many of them didn't commute, because commuting was complicated in those days. So many of them, stayed, with either family or friends, or housing provided by the farmers at that point in time. So my grandfather actually bought 150 some acres from an old farmer of German origin, who my grandfather and his family had previously worked for. So he wasn't unfamiliar with the farm, nor was he unfamiliar with the family that owned it. And in 1940, having worked in his younger years, he worked for the city of Buffalo in what he told me was the ash and can division, which was, essentially the public works department that picked up the garbage.
My grandfather was a garbage man for the city of Buffalo. Wow.
Yeah. So there was the ash and can division, because they scooped the ashes out of the wood or coal burning fireplaces, and also picked up the garbage. But he went from working for the city of Buffalo in the public works department, and bought this farm in Brant. My dad was not yet in high school when they moved from the city to the farm. Of course, the war broke out. World War II broke out. It was already ongoing in Europe at the time the farm was purchased, but Pearl Harbor happened a year plus after they had moved out to Brant. My dad yet wasn't draft age eligible. And by the time he graduated from high school, the war was over. So he had been called up to go and serve, and was prepared to get a train to go to Fort Dix in New Jersey for basic training when the Japanese surrendered. So he went back home, and despite his ambition, I once looked at his high school yearbook, and the high school yearbooks, you typically have a projection of what the graduate hopes to do with his or her life. And my dad, his aspiration was to be a lawyer.
Wow.
In high school. But, the demands of the farm, the demands of the family farm were greater. And he and his older brother stayed on the farm to work with my grandfather. But I can remember at a relatively young age myself, so you and I are pretty close. We're still young guys, pretty close in age to each other. And I can remember in the second Eisenhower's race for re-election in 1956. And a lot of people, wonder how I can remember this, but I remember it vividly, because my dad came home from some political event supporting President Eisenhower, and he brought home for me a button that, if you tilted it the right way, it was the picture of the President Eisenhower, and if you tilted it another way, it said, "I like Ike."
Yeah.
And I can remember him giving me that button.
Yeah.
I still have that button today.
Wow.
So
Wow.
my earliest recollection, in 1956, I was 4 years old.
Yeah.
But I remember vividly that button, which I still have. So that's, the vantage point that I have in terms of my father's earliest active involvement. I would say, Carmen became the chairman in the town of Brant in the 70s. By this time my grandfather had retired. He passed away in 71. So my father and his brother now owned the farm, and they grew that. I mean, in the 1970s, we were harvesting 2,500 acres of snap beans across four different counties in western New York. We're harvesting, several hundred acres of Concord grapes and beans and tomatoes. I mean, we were a very large, robust operation in those days. Even owned a piece of a cooperative that had built a canning factory in Eden, and my father was for a long time the general manager of that canning factory. But in the 1970s, he added to his day job his political interest and became the chairman of the town of Brant. A good friend of ours, who I know you've had on your show before, Tom Reynolds, and you will remember this history. So there was a vacancy. I believe the vacancy occurred when I want to say it was Ron Bennett. I could be wrong about who was the county legislator who was stepping down, but it was a South Towns County legislator who was stepping down, and there was a race amongst the Republicans to determine who would be the party's nominee and go on to November election. Gene Heil, who was at the time the supervisor in the town of Evans, a Republican at the time, was very prominent in the western part of this legislative district, and a young Concord councilman by the name of Tom Reynolds was pretty well known in the eastern end of the district. And I think as both Gene Heil and Tom Reynolds were out there looking for the support of town chairman, at the end of the day, it was my father, who was a chairman in a neighboring town to Evans, throwing his support behind Tom Reynolds, and along with my father, then the South Towns Chairman Committee. So Tom became the designee and went on to win the race in 1982, I believe it was, for the county legislature. And, eventually, as we all know, Tom went on to the Assembly and ultimately to Congress. But, my father played a very instrumental role in helping Tom in that very first county legislative race.
As your father did with a number of people. So Tom obviously is a tremendous example, but your father was helpful to a number of people in terms of counsel, in terms of guidance, in terms of support. I mean, I know myself how much he helped me, and I appreciate you saying the opposite, that I helped him, but he was the senior guy who really had the knowledge. It's people like him that I needed as a mentor, and he just did a great job. And then he mentored you, obviously.
Yeah, he was, I know it sounds self-serving, and I don't mean it to come across in a derogatory fashion in any way, but, my dad was actively involved in Republican politics for probably 5 decades. He never once had a position at the Water Authority. He, never once was, not once in those 50 years did he have a government position. And again, I'm not saying that in any derogatory fashion toward, party leaders who may have government jobs, but he kept his politics separate because, he didn't want to be influenced by, the job, if you will, the paycheck. And he was so principled. I mean, he it's not that he didn't have his enemies. He did have his enemies, particularly in the town of Brant, because, I can vividly remember, the supervisor that I'm going to speak of is now deceased, so I won't name him. But, there was a Republican supervisor who had been elected and reelected, had been serving for 8 years, but Dad just did not believe with, rising taxes and, broken campaign promises that he could support this incumbent Republican for a third term. So he denied this individual the party, the town of Brant committee's nod and allowed for there to be an open primary, which the incumbent lost. But that's kind of the way my father operated it.
Look, I thought your father, he had an even hand. He took care of good people. Look, Dennis, you brought me down memory lane to think about those kinds of things. Russ Cugino is here. We're talking about, the commonality of Italians doing exactly what you've talked about, going to work on the farms. As I said, my mother went to pick beans on the farms. My grandfather worked for the city of Buffalo as a garbage man, but he died at 52, leaving 5 kids. And so they had to work, and, that was an important piece of it in order to survive. They didn't survive on government benefits. They worked, and they sent their kids to these farms. It's such a good tradition that your father had, and I could see it in every conversation I had with your dad, how, the way I like to put it is your dad was all about what I consider the best of American values.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. I humbly, I think, I agree with that. I mean, he was, like I said, he was, proud of his family. He was proud of his country. He was, religious. I mean,
all those things.
Church. He went to church. He didn't just go to church on Sundays. I mean, he was a regular church goer, and a hard worker. I'd like to think that some of that was rubbed off on me. I'm not sure that.
That's where I was going. It did rub off on you, and it had to because of the way he was. And so I met you back in 1978 when you became an assistant district attorney. So now let's turn and talk about you. So tell us about, you went to law school, so you fulfilled the dream that your father wanted?
Yeah. I mean, even though he tried talking me out of it, the summer, the August just before starting law school, he was, so that was the summer of 74, having graduated from Colgate University in May of 74. And I think that he was starting to have a seller's remorse, maybe, if you will, because, he sat me down. We were at the old Cozy Corners in Springville, one early August day for lunch together. And he says, hey, did you ever think about, maybe it might make more sense if instead of going to law school, you got an MBA, and, by the time you completed your MBA, then, maybe we'd have more clarity about, a role that you could play on the farm. And it was a very difficult conversation because, it was his way of suggesting that maybe, I change my career path and take a look at, staying with him on the farm. I mean, and that was really in the real heyday of our production. As I said earlier, 2,500 acres of snap beans, and we were blown and going in those days because the market was different. Consumers, we owned a canning company that was canning beans. I mean, nobody buys canned beans anymore. I mean, if you're buying any vegetables in the supermarket, they're frozen. So the market changed dramatically. I did not see those market forces changing in 1974, but I knew that it just seemed at that point in time I was anxious, I was restless, and wanted. I loved working on the farm. I loved working with my father. It was a family tradition, but I was restless to do something else. So I demurred, didn't take him up on his suggestion of pursuing an MBA, and went to law school.
But he was in your corner 1,000% at every move.
Yeah, he was. As long as he felt that I was making a sound choice as opposed to a frivolous one. Yes, he was in my corner. I was extraordinarily fortunate, and again, times have changed, as you well know, because of your own robust law practice. But I had one goal when I was in law school, and that was to get a job in the Erie County DA's office. My trial technique teacher was Joe McCarthy, who at the time was Ed Cosgrove's first assistant.
Yep.
And he was teaching a trial technique class that I took, and during that semester, he was also on trial where 3 Erie County undercover sheriff deputies had been indicted by the DA's office for, roughing up drug dealers, stealing guns, stealing drugs, stealing money. And Joe McCarthy was the lead prosecutor in that case with, Harold Boreanaz, Bob Murphy, and John Condon, three pillars at the time, representing the sheriff deputies. And I can remember going downtown to watch that trial, and it was, holy cow, this is what I want to do. So I was fortunate. I sent out one resume, and that was to Erie County DA Ed Cosgrove at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thankful to this day that Ed gave me an opportunity and hired me, which is why so many people know as you do. I know that you understand this as well. You and I both have a very strong relationship with the former DA John Flynn. A lot of people, but maybe not everybody knows that John was Ed Cosgrove's nephew.
Yes.
And was when John joined Lippis Matthias 2 years ago. It was an easy thing for me to be active in recruiting John, and it was a Buffalo moment of payback. Paying it forward to how Uncle Ed had helped me many years earlier, and I was happy that John decided to join us. And John Flynn is just a great partner. He's a hard worker. He's a rock solid individual.
He's an excellent lawyer. I've known him for a long, long time. I supported him, obviously. I think a great deal of him, and I think it's a perfect move for you. But let's go back to you again. So 1978, you're joining Ed Cosgrove as an assistant district attorney.
Yep.
And you were there from 1978 through what period of time? Through 19...
Yeah, just 3 months shy of 10 years.
10 years, right.
Dick Arcara gets elected in 1981. And because Ed Cosgrove had decided not to run for re-election.
Right.
So Dick Arcara, who was then the United States Attorney, stepped down to run for DA.
Yeah.
He beat Tom Flaherty in that race in 1981 and became the DA, won re-election in 85. Arcara actually promoted me. So while Ed gave me the opportunity and gave me my start and promoted me into the felony trial section, Dick Arcara was the guy who promoted me to be the grand jury bureau chief, where I served for nearly 7 years, and all along the way, had the ability to try several cases. Selmar Tochi, who was President Reagan's first United States Attorney designee, was promoted after the 84 election. President Reagan asked Sal to go to Washington to serve as a deputy secretary in the Treasury Department, where he was going to be in charge of all of the enforcement agencies of the Treasury Department, including the IRS, which created a vacancy for the position of the United States Attorney. And ultimately, President Reagan, with the urging of guys like Victor Farley, God rest his soul, Jack Kemp. So you mentioned that our mutual friend Russ is in the studio. Yep. So Russ is also just a longtime great friend. But guys like Jack Kemp, Victor Farley, Tom Reynolds, yourself, all put in a good word.
But the reality is, we put in a good word for the right type of individual. That I don't want people to get the idea that the reality clearly is, in my mind, that you were exemplary in terms of your performance. You had that same work ethic that your father always had, and you performed, and you deserved to go where you finally went, and Ronald Reagan, and with it's a question of people making recommendations, but we made those recommendations based on your ability. And again, I was very proud to see that you became the U.S. Attorney in 1988.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, and that was I appreciated it at the time, and still do, your support and the support of others that helped make that a reality. But I just want to point out, because we're talking about ancient history, and guys like you, me, and Russ, lived that history, but many of your listeners might not remember that Ed Cosgrove. So when I was hired in 1978 by Ed Cosgrove, my father was the Republican county chairman in the Republican town chairman in the town of Brant. He had not yet been an officer at the county level, but he was, was already making a name for himself as the town chairman in the little town of Brant and in the South Towns. So Ed knew I was a Republican, and Ed was, a lifelong Democrat,
right?
Kind of a Reagan Democrat, the conservative, moderate to conservative Democrat. And nonetheless, Ed didn't care about party lines, and when he hired me, and quite frankly, I carried that mentality through. I tried to follow that example throughout my public career. Looking for the best people. Not looking first at affiliation, but looking first at the best people, the people who were principled and hardworking and could get the job done. Those were the hiring criteria that Ed Cosgrove taught me to follow, and I tried. I didn't always succeed, but I tried to follow that example throughout my public career as well. So when I got to the U.S. Attorney's Office in 1988, I had the good fortune of, I don't remember exactly why, there was an initiative out of Maine Justice to hire additional staff in the U.S. Attorney's offices. But I had the great fortune of bringing, guys that I had worked with in the DA's office, Mark Perla, Russ Piscalia,
yep.
Tommy Duskowitz,
yep.
To name just a few. Peggy Kelly McFarland. Do you remember her brother Joe?
Yep.
Joe Kelly. As a paralegal, just to name a few. Bill Flynn came with me to the DA's office, from the DA's office as well. And I didn't care. I mean, the names that I just mentioned, I'm not so sure that any of them in 1988 were Republican, but I knew that they were principled, hardworking people that could get the job done. So, I wanted to make sure that I was surrounding myself with, people of principle and integrity who could do the job. I had the good fortune of, Bush 41 wins. He kept the Reagan era United States Attorney. So, one of the proudest possessions that I have, and hangs on my wall in my law office, is my appointment certificate signed by President Ronald Reagan once the Senate confirmed me in 1988. I was one of the last presidential appointees, one of the last Reagan presidential appointees confirmed by the United States Senate. So I was very honored that I was appointed by who I think is one of the greatest presidents in our nation's history.
There's no question in my mind, Ronald Reagan.
And then, because the position is an appointed position, and it's it is also political. I mean, you don't get a presidential appointee just for hanging out on the street corner. You got to be able to do the job, but you also have to be able to navigate the politics of a presidential appointment. So when President Clinton beat George Bush in 1992, the writing was on the wall for me to step aside, which I eventually did in June of 1993, almost 5 years to the day from the time that I had first been appointed. But let me just go back in time for a moment, because I just want to point out that in my time in the DA's office, I also had a lot of great fortune. Was able to be involved in a lot of different matters. As chief of the grand jury bureau, saw every case, every indictment that came from the grand jury for 6.5, 7 years came across my desk. But I was in the right place at the right time when 2 Roman Catholic priests were murdered in the late 1980s. Within a 2-week period, on the east side, Father Bissonette, who was murdered at the parish across the street from ECMC, and a couple of weeks later, Monsignor Hurley, who was murdered at the parish over there off of near St. Matthews. And I just was in the right place at the right time, and worked with guys like Commissioner Ralph Degenhardt, soon-to-be Commissioner Jim Jackson, who was at the time head of homicide, and then Dick Donovan, who was precinct captain, who, when Degenhardt resigned and Jackson became commissioner, Donovan became the chief of homicide. So I worked with 3, in terms of the investigation into the priest homicides. I worked with 3 of the best cops in the city of Buffalo's history at the time. So I had the great fortune of working with 3 great cops and others who were involved in that investigation. But the good fortune of being able to be in a position to try that case. And a lot of people, it wasn't that I was without competition to be the designee to be United States Attorney. But a lot of people at the time that the president nominated me pointed to the fact that I was trying cases, and that
its capabilities. That's right. I mean, look, I certainly know that being involved in the political system is helpful, but having capabilities is what moves you. So that's certainly what we all saw in you. So so you served there, and then the New York State Attorney General. I want to talk about that. That was such a proud moment for Western New York, for someone from Western New York to become New York State's Attorney General, when before you was a Western New Yorker elected to a state-level position. Not as far back as you might think, and when you'll immediately remember when I say the name. But in 1978, the controller,
the former county executive Ned Reagan, was elected state controller in '78. But Ned had a unique background. He was in finance, and he was the longtime county executive in Erie County. But the last time that an attorney general had been elected in Western New York was probably 75 or 80 years
Yeah,
earlier.
Exactly.
So it had been a long time. And
it's a job of so much responsibility, and it's being treated so differently today. So let's talk a little bit about you getting there, first of all. I know that our friend Tom Reynolds was close with Pataki. He made the recommendation. But again, these recommendations come based on ability. And you ran that race, and you were successful in that race, and we were also very proud.
Well, it's kind of, I'm happy that you mentioned Tom, because obviously, as you well know, Tom was, very instrumental and critical in that. But,
sure.
Even kind of behind the scenes. So I left the U.S. Attorney's Office in June of '93. I was engaged to be married to my wife, Kelly. We were not married yet, so had no kids, was not married. Took a month off, to try to hone my golf game, which never really ever improved. But in August, Bob Abrams, who was the longtime Attorney General, who ironically, as we talk about Western New Yorkers, Bob Abrams became Attorney General, I believe in the same year that Ned Reagan became the comptroller, because the Democrats had endorsed a bright and very popular, I believe she was Supreme Court Justice at the time,
Yeah.
a very good lawyer, Dolores Denman. Dolores Denman had been the Democrat Party's nominee to be the AG candidate in 1978. So there was going to be, a Republican from Western New York on the statewide ticket and a Democrat from Western New York on the statewide ticket for different offices. But Bob Abrams, who was then the borough president in the Bronx, challenged Dolores Denman in the primary, and as has been the case almost ever since, when there's a Democrat primary, typically, if not always, the downstate candidate prevails. And so Bob Abrams knocked Dolores off of the statewide ticket through the primary, and he went on to win. The longtime Republican Louis Lefkowitz, who was a Rockefeller Republican, more liberal Republican, but nonetheless Republican. Javits had resigned, and there was an open seat race in '78. So Bob Abrams is now elected in '78. He ran against Al D'Amato in '92 in a race that everybody thought he was going to win, but for a lot of reasons, he lost by 60,000 votes, and most of those votes came as a result of a community battle between African Americans and conservative Jewish community in Brooklyn. And D'Amato was on the right side of the politics of that battle, and he came from behind and defeated Abrams. Otherwise, Abrams would have been a senator. But in August of '93, Abrams announces not only is he not going to run again in '94, but he's quitting, thereby creating an open seat because the legislature was going to appoint his immediate successor, who would then run in the for election in '94. I immediately went to see Tom Reynolds at Republican headquarters, and said, "Hey, Tom, why don't I want to be thinking about running for Attorney General?" And Tom says, "Well, let's start with the fact that in a month you're getting married. So, why don't you get married, go away on your honeymoon, and talk to Kelly about this while you're away. And if you're still interested when you come back from your honeymoon, then we'll start thinking about what we need to do." I came back in September and said, "Yeah, I want to run." And I'll just tell you this quick vignette. So I tell Tom, "Yeah, I'm interested in running." And this was just the end of September, right around Columbus Day, maybe early October. And Bill Paxton, who was then a congressman, calls me up on a Friday and said, "What are you doing tonight?" And I said, "Well, I don't know. I'm just, it's Friday night, just hanging out." And he said, "Well, I'm going to Seneca County to the Republican Party's Columbus Day dinner in Seneca County. And oh, by the way, John Faso, who was an assemblyman at the time and thinking about running for comptroller in 1994, John Faso is in Buffalo, and he's going to ride out with me." He said, "So if you're serious about this AG race," he said, "why don't you get in the truck with us and drive out to Seneca County tonight?" I did. The chairman at the time in Seneca County was Senator Michael Mazzolio, and he graciously put me at a seat at the dais, and actually gave me a couple moments to just stand up at the microphone and say that I was kicking the tires on running for Attorney General. When the evening was over and we were packing up to leave to go back to Buffalo, Senator Mazzolio pulled me aside and said, "Hey, just want to give you a heads up. I called Bill Powers, who at the time was the state Republican committee chairman." He said, "I called up Bill Powers to tell Powers that you were coming to my dinner tonight." And Powers said, "What the hell is Vaco going out to your dinner for?" And Mazzolio said that he told Chairman Powers, "Well, he's thinking about running for Attorney General," which prompted Powers to say, "Of which state?" So that was my first toe in the water exploration of running for AG publicly, and not just talking to Tom Reynolds or my wife about it. And the state party chairman was already being derisive and saying, of what state was I thinking about running for attorney general? So, he was clearly signaling to me that I had a long way to go. But because of Tom and because, dedication to hard work, I made it my mission to start seeing the party leaders. You helped me immeasurably with Mike Long, who was then the statewide Conservative Party chairman. But I traveled the state. Went to every 62 counties to meet the Republican and Conservative Party chairs in every one of those 62 counties. And, because of hard work and just, some luck in building a statewide ticket, I was the nominee of the Republican Party at the convention in May of.
To me, again, this is the Carmen Vaco ethic that is instilled inside of you, the work that needed to be done, and you did it. Look, Dennis, I for guys like us, I really appreciate going down memory lane. There's so much good that you've raised today, but I do want to talk about your term as Attorney General, and especially you going to the U.S. Supreme Court. So tell us a little bit about your term as Attorney General, what you felt you delivered to New York State, and about that case that you actually went to the U.S. Supreme Court.
Yeah, and thanks for giving me the chance to talk about that. So you got to remember that in 1994, crime was a very important topic. Ironically, here we are, 31 years later,
as
and
it is today.
Public safety still is. But crime was an important issue at the time. As we've discussed, my entire career up to this point in time was spent as a prosecutor, so in law enforcement. Rudy Giuliani had won in New York City in 1993, principally on the promise of cleaning up the streets, making New York City safer and more hospitable to not only the people that live there, but to visitors. The death penalty was an important issue in those days. Megan's Law, which was this sexual predators registration proposal, had not yet been enacted in New York State. So it was easy for me to run in '94 as in 1994 as a prosecutor, because that was what my career was all about. Critics said, well, the AG's office really isn't about prosecutions, which is, kind of laughable in view of how the office has been employed over the years by, several Democrat successors of mine. But crime was an important issue. I was at the time supportive of the death penalty. I was at the time a loud advocate on behalf of the sex offender registry, which was dubbed Megan's Law, which in 1995, after Stocky and I were both elected, both with a Republican majority in the state Senate, both of those measures, the death penalty was reintroduced to New York State, and Megan's Law with the sex offender registry, which is still employed today, became law as well.